Hello and welcome. Thank you for listening in today. This video is meant to provide detailed information on DEQ's statewide contamination reduction goals and approved program elements that are now a part of the opportunity to recycle requirements. My name is Gretchen Sandow, and I work for DEQ's Materials Management Program. I'm one of our regional specialists available to help local governments and their service providers navigate new requirements created through the Recycling Modernization Act. Let's start by going over what will be shared in this video. First, I will provide some background information for context. Second will be an overview of DEQ's contamination reduction statewide goals and approved program elements. Third will be an explanation of how a local government can make a request to implement other contamination reduction programs if there is a desire to try different programming not on DEQ's approved list. Fourth, we will review how a local government will report their contamination reduction program in the Opportunity to Recycle report. Fifth will be a quick look at some examples of contamination reduction messaging for educational materials. And lastly, we will review the process that a local government or service provider will go through to request funds for this work. Here's a little background information and some need-to-know names. In 2021, the Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act, otherwise known as the Recycling Modernization Act, or RMA, was passed. In 2024, DEQ approved the program plan from Circular Action Alliance, known as CAA, who is Oregon's one producer responsibility organization, or PRO, and they are a key partner in the implementation and success of RMA. One focus area of the RMA is reducing contamination in the recycling. In addition to requiring improved sorting and removal of contaminants at recycling processing facilities, the RMA requires the PRO to provide up to $3 per capita to local governments to support efforts in reducing contamination in their recycling programs. During the funding authorization process, a local government is able to choose whether they keep some or all of the funding or have some or all of the funding designated to service providers or other entities to implement contamination reduction programming. Next, we will go over what is required of DEQ and local governments. Oregon Revised Statute 459A.929 requires DEQ to establish statewide recycling contamination goals and establish and maintain a list of approved contamination reduction program elements. This work has been completed and will be discussed in more detail later. The document containing the statewide contamination goals and approved program elements can be found on DEQ's RMA website on the Recycling Modernization Act information page under Local Government Resources. A link to the document is also provided within this video. DEQ recommends having the statewide goals and approved program elements document open while watching, as it may be helpful for following along. Now let's talk about what is required for local governments. Oregon Revised Statute 459A.929 sub 2 requires local governments with opportunity to recycle requirements, which are cities over the population of 4,000, their urban growth boundaries, and cities within the Portland Metropolitan Service District, to establish and implement a program to reduce contamination in recycling collected in their jurisdiction. This program must include 3 components. First, to set one or more local recycling contamination reduction goals that are consistent with the statewide goals established by DEQ. Second, to implement at least one element for each of the 3 categories from the contamination reduction approved program element list, or to use materials or methods that are at least as effective as those on the approved list. And third, to have a process for reviewing and revising the local goals and elements as appropriate and at least once every 5 years. Now that we understand what is required for DEQ and local governments, let's dive into more details about the established goals and program elements. As mentioned earlier, Oregon now has 2 established contamination reduction goals, one for high-risk contaminants and one for overall contamination. The statewide goal for high-risk contaminants is 0. Some examples of high-risk materials are sharps, non-empty pressurized gas cylinders, batteries, and animal waste. These high-risk contaminants can pose a risk to staff, equipment, and facilities. Refer to the statewide goals and approved program elements document for a complete list of high-risk contaminants. A local government must also have a goal of 0 for high-risk contaminants in the commingled recycling stream. The second goal is for overall contamination rate. Statewide, our goal is to reach 12.5% contamination in recycling by 2030 and to further reduce that to 10% contamination by 2033. Materials in this category are items such as bagged materials, plastic bags or other stretchy plastic, hoses, cords, or wire, food and liquids, and glass. Similar to the high-risk contaminants, these contaminants can cause issues at sorting facilities, pose health and safety risks to workers, and lower the quality of Oregon recyclables. For the overall contamination rate, local governments can choose the statewide goals, or they can strive for a contamination rate lower than 12.5% by 2030 or lower than 10% by 2033. However, they cannot have a higher percentage of contamination as a goal. Also, please keep in mind that these are contamination reduction goals for your community recycling program, and that there are no regulatory consequences for not meeting the goals. With the review of the statewide goals behind us, it's time to go over the approved list of contamination reduction program elements. This may be a good time to pause and bring the statewide goals and approved program elements document out for reference. Local governments must select at least one element from the 3 categories on DEQ's approved list. The 3 categories are A, customer-facing contamination reduction materials and methods that are responsive to the needs of diverse populations. B, standards for providing feedback to generators that contribute to contamination and that are responsive to the needs of diverse populations. And C, standards for providing financial or service consequences to generators that are significant and repeated sources of contamination and that continue to contaminate recyclables after being subject to elements described in categories A and B. Something to note is that each of the 3 categories includes feedback or consequences that are responsive to the needs or conditions of diverse populations. So what does that all mean? What it means is that information should be accessible to all people in a community regardless of background, ability, preferred language, access to technology, or where they live or work. Best practices for accessibility should be used when appropriate and possible in communications. More information is listed on page 3 of DEQ's statewide goals and approved program elements document. Many local governments and service providers are asking DEQ what contamination reduction activities are eligible with this funding. All activities within each category in the DEQ approved program elements document are eligible. Other eligible expenses are the costs associated with planning and staffing or hiring contractors to do contamination reduction programming. However, for staff or contractors, only time spent on contamination reduction programming is eligible for reimbursement. Contamination reduction programming funds can also be used for program evaluation, but only up to 10% of the total eligible costs. If a local government wants to try other materials or methods not on DEQ's approved list, they may request the use of those other materials or methods by completing a request form that can be found on DEQ's website under Local Government Resources on the Recycling Modernization Act information page. As a reminder, other materials or methods are to be at least as effective as materials or methods on DEQ's approved list. For the next couple of minutes, we are going to take a deeper look into the requirements and approved elements within each category. Let's start at the very beginning with Category A, Approved Customer-Facing Materials and Methods. A local government should start by choosing what sector they would like to focus their contamination reduction programming on. The sectors are single-family, commercial, multifamily, or depot. By selecting one sector and implementing at least one element for each category, A, B, and C is required. However, a local government can choose more than one material or method and even more than one sector if desired. Here are the approved materials and methods for contamination reduction for the single-family sector. Materials range from labels on containers to cart tagging with contamination reduction messaging. Other elements can include standardizing color for containers or lids, or adding cameras to trucks for monitoring recyclables as they are collected and providing feedback to the customer. As with single family, the commercial sector has several materials or methods approved for implementation. Some variations for the commercial sector are container audits, offering technical assistance to customers, or using on-site cameras, which could help with both determining where contamination is coming from and may help deter any illegal dumping in or around recycling containers. Here are the approved materials and methods for multifamily recycling, which are similar to those for commercial. However, two unique methods for multifamily properties are to provide recycling bags or containers to residents for collecting their recyclables in-home and transporting them down to the shared recycle carts. And the other method is to hire or start an apartment champions program that can provide more one-on-one education and may help meet the requirement of being responsive to the needs of diverse populations. The depot sector has 4 approved materials and methods, notably on-site staff to oversee customers at drop-off recycling facilities and help catch contamination at the source and provide in-the-moment education. And finally, a local government can choose to educate all customers through a media campaign. The intent here is that a local government will reach all sectors through multiple media channels such as social media, online videos, or distribution of recycling information in a manner that is responsive to the needs and conditions of diverse audiences. Let's move on to Category B, which are standards for providing feedback to generators or customers who contribute to contamination in recycling. There are 3 approved elements local governments or service providers can use to provide feedback to customers known to contribute to contamination. Local governments can choose any one of the elements shown in the next 3 slides, each describing the required steps within the approved standard. The first option for standards to use for feedback is in element B1. In this scenario, a local government or service provider first documents contamination and then needs to provide specific feedback in 2 different ways. That feedback can be an email to the generator or leaving information on the container. The first feedback should occur as soon as possible, but no later than 3 business days, and the second piece of feedback within 5 days. The second option, B2, has similar standards. Again, documentation of identified contamination and feedback is provided to the customer. However, providing contamination reduction messaging on the container or doorstep needs to happen the same day it is observed. Then, within 5 days, follow up with an email, text, or phone call to that customer. Finally, there is option B3 with some slight variations on providing feedback to generators. In this option, document the identified contamination and provide feedback within 3 business days via sending an email, text, or other electronic communication with the generator, and follow up by sending a postcard, recycling brochure, or other mailer. We've made it to the final section of the Contamination Reduction Programming, which is Category C, the approved standards for applying service or financial consequences to generators. There are 2 elements for local governments and service providers to choose from, C1 and C2. As a reminder, these elements are for generators that are significant and repeated sources of contamination, and who continue to contaminate recycling after receiving targeted feedback that is responsive to the needs of diverse populations. This category builds on the feedback implemented through Category B. Please note that when applying financial consequences to multi-tenant properties, there may be some legal restrictions around passing fees directly to tenants. Let's go over what it means to have significant and repeated contamination to help local governments and service providers understand what would constitute as significant contamination and repeated contamination. DEQ developed these definitions. Significant contamination is the documented presence of the following materials: high-risk contaminants, hoses, cords, or wires, or bagged material, or other contaminants that represent an egregious misuse of the recycling service in either quantity or type. The definition for repeated means that documented recycling contamination occurs at least 3 times within 6 months. Now let's look more into option C1. First, the local government or service provider overseeing the program should check that the customer is the source of both significant and repeated contamination. Then ensure that there was feedback given to the customer in a way that is responsive to the needs of diverse populations, and that the customer was notified using 2 different kinds of outreach. Following the documentation of significant and repeated contamination and the 2 kinds of feedback, the next step is to give the customer remedy options and a warning letter that is verified as received by the customer. After that, the last steps would be to charge the customer a contamination fee or temporarily remove the recycling container. The contamination fee must be set at the lowest corrective level. For multi-tenant properties, their service cannot be terminated as a part of this process. Now let's look at C2. As with the first option, the steps for C2 build on the feedback provided through Category B. First, check that there is documentation that the generator is a source of significant contamination, and that feedback was provided in 2 different ways that are responsive to the needs of diverse populations after both the first and second documented instances of significant contamination. After a third documented instance of significant contamination, the local government or service provider would reach out to that customer by phone, email, or have an in-person conversation to confirm that the customer understands the issue and to identify any barriers to compliance. Then after a 4th documented instance of significant contamination, the customer is sent a warning letter via certified mail that includes A, documentation of the contamination, B, available remedy options, C, potential consequences if a remedy option is not pursued, and D, timeline for responding. Finally, if opportunities to correct the contamination are refused or a response is not received, the customer is charged a contamination fee or their recycling container is temporarily removed. Again, the opportunity to recycle has to be maintained at multi-tenant properties, meaning service cannot be removed, and financial consequences are set at the lowest possible corrective level. When developing a process for applying consequences to generators that are significant and repeated sources of contamination, the local government or service provider should consider the impact of consequences and, to the extent practicable, ensure that the process and the actions taken do not have disproportionately negative impacts on people because of their background, ability, preferred language, access to technology, or where they live or work. Local governments may choose to develop a process that offers many opportunities for customers to learn more, problem solve, and implement solutions before financial or service consequences are applied. Here are a few ideas for helping customers remedy the documented contamination. Customers could be offered to remove contamination from the recycling container, watch a video about recycling, take an online or in-person class about recycling, sign a pledge to recycle right after receiving education, or sign a recycling agreement in their tenant lease. Let me share a little bit more about multi-tenant properties and how standards for feedback and consequences can be addressed. Regarding providing feedback, there are some steps to follow, starting with Category B's feedback standards. If the source of contamination is unknown, provide feedback to the property manager that can be passed along to the tenants. If the source of contamination is known, feedback may be provided to the property manager and to the generator directly. Next is Category C, Standards for Consequences. For multi-tenant properties, if the generator of contamination is known and has received targeted feedback, consequences may be applied directly to that generator to the extent allowed by law. Otherwise, consequences may be applied to the property manager. Remember, multi-tenant recycling services cannot be taken away due to contamination, and service must be maintained so that other tenants who do not contribute to contamination continue to have the opportunity to recycle. Now, let's look at the steps needed to implement other contamination reduction programming that is not included on the DEQ approved list. If a local government wants to try a different material or method for contamination reduction programming, they will need to complete a request form for approval of the other program. The request form is only 2 pages long and does not require a submittal of an implementation plan. If implementing other programming, DEQ suggests submitting the request form as soon as possible. The form can be found on DEQ's RMA webpage under Local Government Resources on the Recycling Modernization Act information page. For any additional assistance, contact your regional specialist. As a reminder, other contamination reduction programs must be at least as effective as the elements on DEQ's approved list. Please include the following information on the request form: a description of the materials and methods that will be used for contamination reduction programming. Explain how the materials and methods are as effective as those on DEQ's approved list for Category A. Next, provide a description of the standards to provide feedback to generators that contribute to contamination and how this feedback is responsive to the needs of diverse populations. This covers Category B. And finally, include a description of the standards the other program will have to provide financial or service consequences to generators that are significant and repeated sources of contamination, and how these consequences are responsive to the needs of diverse populations. Please answer all questions. I would also like to add that if a local government only wants to implement other programming for only one of the categories and use approved program elements for the other categories, that is allowed. DEQ asks that in the request form to please indicate which approved program elements are being implemented in addition to any other programming. An example of this would be choosing other programming for category A, but choosing an approved program element for categories B and C. For any questions or for a review of the request form before finalizing or official submittal, feel free to work directly with your DEQ regional specialist. Once the request form is finalized, have the appropriate local government official sign before submitting to DEQ. If multiple jurisdictions are implementing the same program, a joint request form may be submitted. However, all of the jurisdictions will need to have a local government official sign the joint request form. When completed, submit the signed request form to your DEQ regional specialist. Moving along, let's review how a local government will report on their contamination reduction programming to DEQ. To evaluate compliance with the new requirements, local governments with a population over 4,000 and local governments within the Portland Metropolitan Service District will report on contamination reduction programming in the annual Opportunity to Recycle report. DEQ has not finalized the 2025 Opportunity to Recycle report form yet, but here is a sneak peek of the draft section where contamination reduction programming will be reported on. At the beginning of this section, there is a space to indicate if the local government or service provider is implementing elements from the DEQ approved list or has requested approval for other contamination reduction programming. Next are boxes to indicate contamination reduction goals that have been chosen, and then which sector or sectors are being focused on. This is a reminder that multiple sectors may be chosen, but at least one sector needs to have a program element from categories A, B, and C applied to it. The next part of the report form is where the specific elements chosen for each of the three categories, A, B, and C, will be covered. DEQ suggests having the statewide goals and approved program elements document open while filling out this section of the report form, because each category will ask for the corresponding number for which element has been chosen. The examples in red show how DEQ would like a local government or their service provider to report on which contamination reduction program elements they have implemented for the, quote, which elements have been or will be implemented line, which is the first bullet point under each category. In the first example shown, the local government has chosen the single-family sector, and for category A, they used method number 3, a mailer, and this corresponds to the number on the approved list of elements in Table A under single family. The next part of the report form is where the specific elements chosen for each of the three categories A, B, and C will be covered. DEQ suggests having the statewide goals and approved program elements document open while filling out this section of the report form, because each category will ask for the corresponding number for which element has been chosen. The examples in red show how DEQ would like a local government or their service provider to report on which contamination reduction program element they have implemented. This will go on the quote, which elements have been or will be implemented line, and it is the first bullet point under each category. In the first example shown, the local government chose single family as the sector, and for category A, they used method number 3, a mailer, which corresponds to the number on the approved list of elements in table A under single family. This is also just an example of how the reporting could look. Of course, local responses may be different than the examples provided. For category B in this example, option B1 was chosen. And for category C, this example local government chose C2 for the service or financial consequences. Also, like most other opportunity to recycle programs, DEQ will be asking for supporting documentation. This may be a copy of the cart tag that was used or a copy of the mailer that was sent to all customers. And finally, if other programming has been implemented for contamination reduction, there will be a space on the form at the end of the section for a local government or their service provider to describe how the approved other program was implemented. As I just mentioned, supporting documentation will be required in the OTR report. DEQ has received many questions around what kind of messaging needs to be included on educational materials, so let's look at some examples. The examples given are of existing educational materials. The first two examples are ones that need contamination reduction messaging added to them, and the third is an example that already has appropriate contamination reduction messaging included. Let's start with example 1. This is an existing cart decal. Above the picture, DEQ has provided suggested language that could easily be added, so it includes contamination reduction messaging. Adding this suggested language informs the public on what items are considered contamination in the recycling stream. Example 2 is of an existing OOPS tag or cart tag. Once again, at the top, you can see that DEQ has provided suggested language that could be added to the tag, so it would include contamination reduction messaging. This third example is also of an OOPS tag or cart tag. However, in this example, the tag already includes contamination reduction messaging down towards the bottom and is good to go as is. If there are questions about appropriate contamination reduction messaging, please reach out to your DEQ regional specialist, as they would be happy to assist you. Now, let's shift gears and talk about the final portion of this video, which is all about the funding for this work. To receive any funding from CAA, the first step is to sign a primary funding agreement, or PFA. CAA provides a step-by-step process for completing the PFA on their website. During the process of completing the PFA, notify CAA of the other types of funding being requested, including contamination reduction funding. After the PFA is executed, the next action is to establish a connection with CAA about contamination reduction programming. And this can happen in two ways. Either CAA will reach out based on jurisdiction's priority level, or a local government and/or their service provider can contact CAA directly to move forward with the next phase of the addendum process at organinfo@circularaction.org. Please note that prior to connecting with CAA, a local government or service provider should know or at least have an idea of what contamination reduction programming is going to look like for the jurisdiction and any estimated costs of that programming. That means knowing which sector or sectors are going to be focused on and which elements from the DEQ approved list are going to be implemented. Planned programming and estimated costs will need to be provided to CAA via the addendum application. That said, neither CAA nor DEQ are requiring a separate written plan of any kind to be submitted in order to receive funding. As mentioned earlier, and throughout this video, there is a request form and process if a local government or service provider is preparing to implement elements that are not on the DEQ approved element list. Again, for any questions about other programming, please reach out to your DEQ regional specialist. CAA cannot approve elements and activities. They require an approval from DEQ for all other programming before moving forward with the addendum process. Next, CAA will provide the local government or service provider with an application that requires additional information. The application workbook includes 3 tabs/sheets with instructions for completion. There is the application. This section will ask general questions about contacts and billing at your organization, what programming is intended to be implemented, the total eligible funding amount, what communities the elements will be implemented in, the funding amount being requested, and what type of funding is being requested, so upfront, reimbursement, or advance. The second tab is about Phase 1 Initial Benchmarking Analysis. As the name suggests, this section asks questions regarding benchmarking. It asks for which communities the programming will be implemented in, what current spending pre-program costs are, if known, what the current contamination rate is, if known, which elements are intended to be implemented, and cost estimates for each element chosen. The third tab is a Phase 2 work completion. This section is to be completed after the implementation of the programming. And the deliverables for it include proof of implementation, such as receipts, community served, funding amount used, dates deployed, and a summary of findings and/or results. Once you have completed the application and the Phase 1, please send it to CAA. Based on the information provided, Miller Nash will send the draft contamination reduction addenda for review and approval. The final addendum will be sent for signature via DocuSign. DocuSign provides a digital copy of the final executed addendum for record keeping. After execution of the addendum, a purchasing order will be provided that can be used when submitting requested funds through the service provider portal. And lastly, to actually receive the funds or reimbursement, make sure that an account has been set up within CAA's service provider portal which is where requests for funding will be submitted. And just like that, we have concluded the last portion of this video dedicated to contamination reduction programming. Provided here is CAA's general information email address for any questions and 2 website URLs. The first URL is CAA's website, which includes an organ-specific page for the RMA. The second URL is specifically for Oregon's education and outreach campaign, which includes the Recycle On logo in case you haven't seen it. That was a lot of information about contamination reduction programming. DEQ staff are committed to helping our local governments and service providers understand RMA and all of its components. Here are the regional specialists around the state and their assigned counties. Please reach out if you have any questions or if you would like to submit a request for other contamination reduction programming. Thank you for listening to this video today. And again, please contact your DEQ regional team if you have any questions. And I hope you have a great